Hi, this is Phil Leage. In the previous teaching we looked at the nature of the literature of Gospel, and we spoke about the Synoptic Gospels, and what I'd like to do in this teaching is explore with you the nature of these Gospels and the so-called synoptic problem. Now, first of all, the term Synoptic Gospels refers to the three Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and because these Gospels have striking similarities, and they can actually be put in parallel columns, and this arrangement is called a synopsis. There on the screen is a picture of a very helpful book that actually does this, and there on the screen is a picture of what you find. There you see the text of Matthew 13, of Mark 4 and Luke 8, and they're parallel passages, and you're able to compare how each Gospel writer has presented that particular portion. Another example here is Matthew 5 and Luke 6, the Beatitudes. Matthew has many more than Luke, but Luke has some too, and you can see them side by side. Because of the similarities, Matthew, Mark and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels. This word comes from the Greek synoptikos, which means to see the whole together or to take a comprehensive view. And so when we talk about Synoptic Gospels, that's what we're talking about: Matthew, Mark and Luke. Now, I want to address what some people call the synoptic problem. I'm not really sure there is a problem, as we will see, but this is often the term that is used in this particular discussion. And just to identify what this is, I will quote from the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. The synoptic problem is the name that has been given to the problem of why the Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke look so much alike. Why are they so similar in content, in wording and in order of events found within them? And so this is what this whole subject is about. We have three Gospels that are very similar, and we will explore the similarities in a few moments, but of course there's differences as well. And the question is, how did these Gospel writers, if they wrote independently of one another, how did they come up with documents that have so many similarities? Okay, let's explore this. Firstly, there's a similarity of content, we'll look at that. There's similarity of arrangement, and there's similarity of language. Let's explore these. The three Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, as you will know, they report the same miracles, and some have miracles that others don't have. We know that, but they report the same miracles. Often there's the same parables, the same discussions and debates and arguments that Jesus has with his disciples or with the Pharisees or the officials, and the same principal events. Now, just to help with terminology, passages found in all three Gospels are known as a threefold tradition. Passages found in two of the Gospels are known as a twofold tradition. And you won't be surprised to know that passages found in only one Gospel is called the unique tradition. Mark is the shortest Gospel. And interestingly, almost all of the material occurs in Matthew or in Luke. So if you read Matthew and then you read Mark and you think, I've read this before, it's because you have. There's very little material that is unique to Mark. Matthew contains approximately 670 verses of Mark. So 90% of Mark is in Matthew. Luke contains more than half of Mark, around about 340 verses. And these verses are approximate because often we're dealing with part of a verse or 2/3 of a verse. So these figures are not exact, but they give you an idea. Now, Matthew has 30% unique material. 70% of Matthew is either in Luke or in Mark. And Luke contains 50% unique material. 50% of Luke you find either in Matthew or in Mark, or in both, of course. And so there on the screen is a table of the way this works out, with the unique, the twofold and the threefold tradition, and the different Gospels. You can look at that and note that. But note especially that for Mark, only about 70 verses are unique to Mark. There's also the similarity of arrangement. The course of Jesus' life and ministry are presented in a similar fashion. If you look at the table on the screen, you'll see this, that they all begin with the preliminaries to the ministry, and by that we mean the baptism of Jesus, the affirmation of the Father, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. And then the geography is the same in each one. There's the Galilean ministry, and then there's the journey to Jerusalem, and then you have the passion, crucifixion, the resurrection. Now you'll notice how when it comes to the journey to Jerusalem, Luke has many more chapters in that particular part of Jesus' ministry. Mark and Matthew only have about a chapter or 2 chapters, but nonetheless the order is the same. Now John, in his Gospel, he has Jesus visit Jerusalem on a number of occasions during his 3.5 years ministry, and so we know that Jesus was in Jerusalem a number of times during his time of ministering. But Matthew, Mark and Luke, we wouldn't know that. We simply have Jesus in Galilee, and then the final journey to Jerusalem, and then the passion and the resurrection. And there on the screen is a map. So it is the Galilee, and then that final journey down to Judea, and then Jerusalem. So there's a similarity of arrangement of the material. And there's also a similarity of language. Now, this in the English text, as we read it, we wouldn't necessarily know this, but those who are familiar with the Greek language, they're able to inform us that many passages show agreement in language and in wording. This does come out in the English text at different times. You will recognize this. But what is interesting, that sometimes not only does it show agreement in language and wording, but unusual Greek constructions are used. Constructions that may be a little bit awkward, and they're in all 3 of the Gospels. Sometimes comparatively rare Greek words are used, and they are used in the Gospels. And what this indicates is there's some kind of connection between these Gospels. And the question is, what is that connection? And if you want to explore the similarity of language, there on the screen are 3 different options for you to check, and I would invite you to check those should you choose. Okay, some passages, when it comes to language, agree word for word. And when there is a quote from the Old Testament, and this is what is interesting, when there's a quote from the Old Testament, this quote, there's an agreement in all of the synoptic Gospels on that quote, when that quote is not from, it's not a translation of the Hebrew, nor is it a direct quote from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. So, in other words, that quote is from somewhere else that has been lost to us. But the point is, it's the same in each of the Synoptic Gospels. Now, of course, there's dissimilarities too. And there's dissimilarities of content and dissimilarities of arrangement. Some accounts are only in one or maybe two Gospels. Sometimes when there is an account in two Gospels, they differ a little or sometimes greatly. So, for example, the birth narrative of Matthew and Luke are very different. Matthew focuses on Joseph and Luke on Mary. The genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke are different, as you may be aware. The Sermon on the Mount in Matthew is different to the so-called Sermon on the Plain, as people like to call it, in Luke 6, which seems to be the same teaching of Jesus. Of course, Jesus probably gave that message many times in his 3.5 years ministering. You may know that the order of the temptations in Luke and in Matthew are a slightly different order. And so there's dissimilarities of content. And there's dissimilarities of arrangement. And we've looked at this a little bit when we looked at the genre of gospel in the previous teaching. One groups the material in one place and the other scatters it throughout. Luke, interestingly, follows Mark's order more closely than Matthew, according to scholars who've studied this in great detail. And so, why is this the case? There's been various solutions offered. One is that the writers were independently using oral traditions, and we have spoken about that in our previous teaching. But this doesn't really explain the complete verbal agreement and vocabulary and awkward words and this kind of thing. And so it would seem there was some kind of literary interdependence between them. In other words, each writer in some way was dependent upon another. Now, the traditional understanding, the one that has been most popular, is that Matthew was the first writer. He wrote his gospel. He had been with Jesus and he wrote down those things he remembers. And then Luke used Matthew when he composed his gospel, and we've seen how at the beginning of Luke he said that. He says many have compiled narratives of the things that Jesus has said and done. And so we know that Luke had other documents in front of him when he wrote his gospel. And then Mark had both Matthew and Luke when he wrote his. Now, even though this has been a popular view for many years, it has lost its popularity now, and one of the reasons has been a resurgence in Markan studies. And for many years Mark was the forgotten gospel, because it was the shortest and because most of the material is in Matthew. It wasn't given much attention. But in recent years the study of Mark has grown, and it is noted that Matthew, when there are stories in Matthew and Mark, Matthew seems to abridge Mark. In other words, he would shorten it. And it is more likely that you would shorten something to serve your purposes than take something and make it longer. Also, it's noted how Mark is more lively than Matthew, and when you study Mark you'll notice this. Immediately Jesus did this, immediately he did that, and the word "and" is used many, many times. It's a very vibrant, lively, quick gospel. But more than that, Mark's Greek we understand, is poorer than Matthew's. Mark's Greek is the kind of Greek a child might write, and Matthew has a better quality of Greek. And if Mark was to be using Matthew, he wouldn't dumb down the language of Greek, surely. If the Greek was better than he had, he would use it. But that is not the case. And so, even though some would hold this, generally speaking, this approach has been rejected today. Now, can I just say that there are many different thoughts on this subject and many ideas, and all the time this question is being addressed and looked at. But today, one of the approaches that is most popular is that Mark is the source for both Matthew and Luke. Now, this could easily be the case, as for Luke, as we've seen. He says that he has not only eyewitness accounts, but he has other documents. And Matthew too could have had Mark in front of him when he wrote his gospel. Now, Mark, as we've seen, is the memoirs of Peter, or it's Mark got his understanding from the Apostle Peter. And we know that Matthew walked with Jesus. But if you're writing something, if you're doing a work and someone has done something, it's not unusual to use what they've done, even if you know the subject well yourself. I've done that myself. If I've had to do something, rather than start from scratch, I would maybe take something someone else has done and use it and adapt it for my purposes. And so the popular understanding today is that the first gospel was Mark, and then Matthew and Luke used Mark, and they changed the language, improved the Greek, etc., etc., but nonetheless they used Mark. And this would explain the threefold tradition. They used Mark's material. But what about the material that's only common to Matthew and Luke? And in some of this material that Matthew and Luke agree on, clearly there's a connection between this as well. There is a source that Matthew and Luke use that is separate from Mark. And this is commonly known in scholarly circles as Q. It is from the German word which means source. And the existence of this document, we have to say, is pure conjecture. But when the passages in common to Matthew and Luke are studied, they are mostly teachings of Jesus. Not so much his actions and miracles, but his teachings. And so people have suggested that one of the documents that Luke spoke about in the beginning of his gospel was a collection of the teachings of Jesus, and that Matthew had access and Luke had access to this document as well. So as they independently sat down to write their gospels, Luke had his eyewitness accounts, he had he had Mark, he had this document and presumably other documents too. Matthew, he had Mark, he had this material Q, if it existed, or maybe other documents, but he had also, of course, his own experience. And then what these writers did was took this material and adapted it for the people that they were addressing. Each gospel writer, when they sat down to write their gospel for their intended audience, they sat down and they used different resources, as well as Matthew, his own experience with Jesus, and inspired by the Holy Spirit, they crafted the gospels that we have today and that enrich us so much. So the facts. as we know them. They seem to be that Mark, he wrote this extended sermon of Peter that we looked about and talked about in the previous session. Luke used different material and his own research to write his gospel. He says so at the beginning of his gospel, Luke chapter 1, 1 through 4. Matthew, he of course was an eyewitness, yet nonetheless he had Mark before him and this other document, or wherever these stories came from. Some have suggested that Matthew actually was the author of this so-called Q document, but that would be another discussion. And so, looking at it in practical form, we have Mark. He wrote the memoirs of Peter. He informed Matthew. Matthew, of course, had his own special sources. He was an eyewitness himself, and then he had this so-called Q document. Luke, he did his. He also had Mark. He had his own research, we read, and then also this Q document. And so what we have is a solution as to how Matthew, Mark and Luke are so similar yet different. Now, maybe when we get to heaven and talk to these people, we'll find there was another answer, who knows. But certainly this is a good solution. Now, the value of reflecting on the different authors and the way they have taken their material and adapted it can be seen in Luke 3 and Matthew 3. This is the message of the preaching of John the Baptist, and I just want you to notice how Luke, he says this. John the Baptist said therefore to the crowds that came out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bear fruit that in keeping with repentance." But notice what Matthew does. You see, he takes this same passage, this same tradition of the preaching of John the Baptist, but he focuses it on the scribes and the Pharisees. And this is in keeping with the whole goal and aim of Matthew, and that is to expose the teaching of the Pharisees and the scribes, which would have had such a hold on the Jewish people, so that they'd be open to receiving the message of Jesus, their Messiah. The order of the temptations, the genealogies of Jesus and Luke. When we notice the differences, we can see the emphasis. Now, we will be exploring these as we come to Luke and as we come to Matthew. But recognizing there's similarities and there's differences, and being able to look at them side by side, as we saw in that synoptic gospel presentation, is really helpful for us in emphasizing the differences and highlighting the focus of each of the gospel writers.